350 pounds of muscle slammed Harrison Ford chest first into a concrete wall backstage, the bodyguard's forearm crushing against Ford's throat before the actor even saw him coming. Clint Eastwood stood 15 feet away, watching in silence as Ford clawed at the massive arm, pinning him off the ground. And what happened next left witnesses too shaken to speak about it for years. What happened in the next 90 seconds would become Hollywood legend, a story whispered about for decades. The fist came out of nowhere and caught Harrison Ford right below the left eye. 350 pounds of bodyguard momentum behind it, and Ford's head snapped sideways so hard his boots left the ground for half a second before his shoulder blade cracked against the concrete wall backstage. What happened in the next 45 seconds would become Hollywood legend, a story whispered about for decades in backlots and studio commissaries, a moment so savage and so unexpected that the people who saw it still argue about the details to this day. But I need to back up. Not far. Just enough so you understand why a man the size of a small truck decided to put his hands on one of the biggest movie stars on the planet, and why the aftermath nearly destroyed a career that had nothing to do with either of them. This was 1984. Clint Eastwood was shooting a promotional segment at a studio event in Burbank. Not a movie set. Think industry showcase, corporate suits, network executives, a couple of open bars, and enough ego in one building to fuel a rocket launch. Eastwood had brought along his personal security, a guy named Dale Rushton. Now, I'm not going to spend 5 minutes telling you Dale Rushton's life story. Here's what matters. He was 6'4". He was north of 350 pounds, and he had a reputation in the security world as the kind of guy you hired when you didn't want problems, and if problems showed up anyway, you wanted them to leave on a stretcher. Believe me, that reputation was earned. Rushton had been with Eastwood for about a year at this point. Clint liked him because Dale didn't talk much, moved fast for a big man, and understood something most bodyguards never figure out. Your job isn't to make yourself look tough. Your job is to make the principal look untouchable. Dale did that. He stood behind Eastwood at events with his arms folded and his jaw set, and people just naturally gave Clint an extra 3 feet of space. It worked. Eastwood never had to deal with grabby fans, aggressive paparazzi, or drunk executives who wanted to pitch their screenplay about a cowboy astronaut. The problem was, Dale Rushton had a trigger, and that trigger was disrespect, not disrespect toward himself. He could handle that. He'd been called every name you could think of, and he'd just stare through you until you felt stupid and walked away. No, Dale's trigger was disrespect toward Clint. In Dale's mind, Eastwood wasn't just a client, he was the man. Capital T, capital M. Clint had given Dale a chance when other security firms had let him go for being too aggressive. Clint had treated him like a human being, not a piece of furniture that happened to block doorways. And Dale had taken that loyalty and welded it to his chest and decided that anyone who crossed Clint Eastwood was crossing him. Get this. 2 months before the Burbank event, a photographer at a restaurant in Carmel had gotten too close to Eastwood's table, snapping flash photos right in Clint's face while he was eating dinner. Dale didn't say a word. He just stood up from the adjacent table, walked over, took the camera out of the photographer's hands the way you'd take a toy from a toddler, opened the back, pulled the film out, handed the empty camera back, and sat down. The photographer filed a complaint. Nothing came of it. But the message was clear. Dale Rushton considered Clint Eastwood's personal space a sovereign nation, and he was the standing army. Now here's where Harrison Ford enters the picture, and here's where the night goes sideways. Ford was at the same Burbank event. He'd just wrapped Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. The movie was about to hit theaters and the studio was riding high. Ford was in a decent mood, which if you know anything about Harrison Ford in the 1980s means he was slightly less irritable than usual. The man wasn't unfriendly. He just didn't do small talk. He showed up, he did his job, he went home. He once told a reporter that the best part of being famous was that people left you alone in restaurants because they were too nervous to approach. That's Harrison Ford. He liked the buffer zone. So Ford's at this event, and he's got a drink in his hand, and he's talking to Steven Spielberg in a corner near the backstage area. The two of them had been working together so much at this point that they had their own shorthand. Spielberg would start a sentence, and Ford would finish it. They're laughing about something, probably some on-set disaster from Temple of Doom, and Ford's got his back to the hallway that leads to the green rooms. Here's what nobody tells you about these industry events. The layout is chaos. You've got a list talent sharing hallways with caterers. You've got studio heads walking past coils of electrical cable. There are no velvet ropes backstage. It's just a maze of corridors and doors and people trying to find the bathroom. And in that kind of environment, collisions happen, not metaphorical collisions, actual, physical body-to-body impacts. Ford excused himself from Spielberg. Needed to use the restroom or get another drink, accounts differ. He turned around and headed down the backstage hallway, moving at a normal pace, not rushing, just walking, and at the same time, coming from the opposite direction, Clint Eastwood was heading toward the main event floor with Dale Rushton 2 steps behind him. The hallway was narrow, I mean genuinely narrow. 2 people could walk side by side if they both turned slightly. 3 people? No chance. And what you had here was Harrison Ford coming one direction and Clint Eastwood plus 350 pounds of Bodyguard coming the other direction. Ford and Eastwood saw each other. Both men nodded. They knew each other, not well, but the way A-listers know each other. You've been at the same award shows. You've shaken hands at premieres. There's a mutual respect thing that happens between guys at that level. Neither of them had a problem with the other, but the hallway geometry didn't care about mutual respect. Ford stepped to one side to let Eastwood pass. Eastwood stepped to the same side. That awkward dance you do with strangers on a sidewalk. They both laughed. Ford put his hand up and stepped the other way. Eastwood did the same, and in that little shuffle, Ford's shoulder brushed against Clint's chest. Not hard, not aggressive. The kind of contact that happens 1,000 times a day in crowded places. Ford actually said, "Excuse me," and gave a little half-wave and kept walking. That should have been the end of it. I swear this happened. Dale Rushton's hand shot out and grabbed Harrison Ford by the shoulder. Not a tap, a grab. The kind of grip that stops your whole body and makes your neck whip. Ford stumbled backward a half step. He turned around with his eyebrows up, more confused than angry. And Dale Rushton was standing there with his chest puffed out and his eyes locked on Ford with an expression that said, "You just made a mistake." "You don't touch Mr. Eastwood," Dale said. His voice was low, flat. The voice of a man who has rehearsed this moment in his head 100 times and was thrilled to finally use it. Ford looked at Eastwood, then back at Dale, then back at Eastwood. He was trying to read the situation. Was this a joke? Was Clint going to wave his guy off? Because this was insane. 2 grown men in a narrow hallway, one of them a megastar with his hands still slightly raised from saying "excuse me," and a 350-pound bodyguard treating an accidental shoulder brush like an assassination attempt. Eastwood, to his credit, immediately read the room. He put his hand on Dale's arm. "Dale, it's fine, he's fine, we're good." But Dale didn't move. His hand was still on Ford's shoulder. His fingers were pressing into the fabric of Ford's jacket. And here's the thing about Dale Rushton that Eastwood probably should have flagged months earlier. Once Dale decided someone had disrespected Clint, the off switch broke. It didn't matter what Clint said. Dale had already categorized this as a threat, and Dale dealt with threats one way. Ford's jaw tightened. You could see the cords in his neck. He looked down at Dale's hand on his shoulder, then looked up into Dale's face. Harrison Ford was not a small man. 6'1", athletic build. He'd done his own stunts in 2 Indiana Jones films and spent months training in hand-to-hand choreography. But the size difference here was staggering. Dale had 150 pounds on him, easy, maybe more. Ford was staring up at a human wall. "Take your hand off me," Ford said. Quiet, controlled. The kind of quiet that tells you a man is giving you exactly one chance. Dale didn't take his hand off. Instead, he squeezed. Not enough to injure, enough to send a message, enough to say, "I'm in charge of this hallway and you're going to stand here until I decide you can leave. Now listen to me." What happened next took maybe 4 seconds, but everyone who was in that hallway remembers it in slow motion. Ford didn't step back. He stepped forward, into Dale's space, right up against that enormous chest, and he brought his left hand up and closed it around Dale's wrist, not the hand on his shoulder, the wrist, and he pressed his thumb into the soft spot between the 2 tendons on the inside of Dale's wrist, and he pushed. This is the thing about Harrison Ford that people forget. The guy wasn't just acting tough in those movies. He'd grown up rough. He'd been a carpenter before Hollywood. He'd spent years swinging hammers, hauling lumber, and developing the kind of grip strength that doesn't come from a gym. When Ford grabbed your wrist, you knew it. Dale felt the pressure. His fingers loosened on Ford's shoulder just slightly, and in that half-second window, Ford used his right hand to chop downward against Dale's forearm, breaking the grip entirely. He took one step back and set his feet. Balanced. Ready. Mark this moment, because this is where a normal confrontation would have ended. The grip is broken. Both men are separated. Eastwood is right there saying it's fine. Any reasonable person backs down. Dale Rushton was not a reasonable person. Not when it came to Clint. He swung. That's the punch I told you about at the top. A massive, looping right hand that came from somewhere near Dale's hip and traveled upward in a vicious arc. Ford saw it coming. He turned his head maybe 20 degrees, which is probably what saved his cheekbone from shattering. But the fist still connected below his left eye with enough force to send him backward and off his feet. His shoulder blade hit the concrete wall. His drink, which he'd apparently still been holding in his right hand this entire time, exploded against the floor. Glass everywhere. For 1 second, the hallway was still. Ford was against the wall, one hand on his face, feeling the damage. Dale was standing in the center of the corridor, breathing hard, his fist still clenched. Eastwood had taken a step back, his mouth slightly open, processing what his own bodyguard had just done. Trust me when I tell you this. Eastwood was horrified. Whatever Dale's intentions were, Clint had never authorized anything even close to this. You don't punch Indiana Jones backstage at an industry event. That's not security. That's assault. That's a lawsuit. That's a career-ending moment for everyone involved. But before Eastwood could say a word, Ford pushed himself off the wall. And this is the part of the story that makes Harrison Ford. Harrison Ford. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He didn't call for help. He wiped the blood from under his eye with the back of his hand, looked at the red smear on his skin, and then looked at Dale Rushton with an expression that multiple witnesses later described as genuinely terrifying. Not angry, not panicked, cold. The way a man looks when he's already decided what he's going to do and he's just picking the sequence. Okay, Ford said. One word. That's all he said. Okay. And then he moved. Ford came in low, way lower than Dale expected. He drove his shoulder into Dale's midsection and wrapped both arms around the big man's torso and pushed with his legs. Now, moving 350 pounds is not something most people can do, but Ford wasn't trying to tackle him to the ground. He was trying to drive him backward, off balance. And he did. Dale stumbled back 3 steps. His heel caught on a cable run that was taped to the floor. And for one surreal moment, 350 pounds of professional bodyguard was airborne. His back hit the floor with a sound that people in the main event space later said they thought was something falling off the lighting rig. Here's the thing, though. Dale was tough, genuinely tough. He'd been in bar fights, street altercations, security incidents that got physical. Getting knocked down didn't finish him. He rolled sideways and started getting up, and he was fast about it. For a man his size, the speed was alarming. Ford saw him rising and didn't wait. He stepped in and threw a straight right hand that caught Dale on the ear. Not a haymaker, a boxer's punch. Short, compact, aimed at a soft target. Dale's head turned, his hands went up, and Ford hit him again, this time a left to the body, right below the ribs on the right side. Liver shot. If you've never been hit in the liver, count yourself fortunate. It's the kind of pain that doesn't announce itself immediately. It blooms, it spreads. And about 2 seconds after it lands, your body decides on its own that you're done standing up. Dale's knees buckled. Not all the way down, but enough. He went to one knee, his right hand on the floor, his left hand on his side where Ford had hit him. He was sucking air through his teeth, and Ford was standing over him with blood running down his face from the cut under his eye, his fist still up, breathing hard but controlled. This was the moment. Right here. The hallway, the concrete, the broken glass on the floor catching the fluorescent light. Harrison Ford with blood on his face standing over a man who outweighed him by 150 pounds. Clint Eastwood frozen 3 feet away. 2 caterers at the end of the corridor holding trays, absolutely petrified. And here's what kills me about this story. Here's the part that separates Harrison Ford from 99% of the people who have ever been in a fight. He stopped. Ford took one step back. He lowered his fists. He looked at Dale, who was on one knee trying to breathe, and then he looked at Eastwood. Clint, get your guy under control. That's it. 7 words. No screaming. No threats about lawyers. No I'll end your career speech. Just a calm, direct instruction from one professional to another. Get your guy under control. Now you might think that's the end of the physical confrontation, and technically you'd be right. Nobody threw another punch in that hallway. But the fallout from what had just happened was already spreading through that building faster than the speed of gossip. And in Hollywood, the speed of gossip approaches the speed of light. You need to understand something about the entertainment industry in 1984. There were no cell phones, no social media, no TMZ. When something happened at an event, the story traveled by mouth, and mouths in Hollywood are unreliable narrators. By the time the story reached the other side of the building, it had mutated. Some people heard that Eastwood and Ford had gotten into a fistfight. Others heard that a bodyguard had attacked Ford with a weapon. One version had Ford unconscious on the floor. Another had Dale Rushton being carried out by paramedics. None of these were true, but all of them were being told with absolute confidence by people who had heard it from someone who had heard it from someone who had been near the hallway. The truth was simpler and more complicated at the same time. Ford was standing in the hallway with a cut under his eye that was going to need attention. Dale was getting to his feet slowly, the liver shot still doing its work. Eastwood was between them now, his hand on Dale's chest, talking to him in a low voice that nobody else could hear. Whatever Clint was saying, Dale's face was changing. The aggression was draining out of it. Something else was replacing it. Something that looked, for the first time, like the recognition that he had just made the worst decision of his professional life. No kidding. Think about it from Dale's perspective for a second. He had just assaulted Harrison Ford. Not some random guy at a bar, not a paparazzo. Harrison Ford, the biggest box office draw on the planet. A man with access to the best lawyers in the world. A man whose face was literally on billboards across Los Angeles at that very moment promoting the biggest movie of the summer. Dale hadn't just committed assault. He'd committed assault against a man whose bruised face would be visible to every entertainment journalist on Earth. And he'd done it in front of witnesses. The caterers at the end of the hall hadn't moved. They were still standing there with their trays, staring. A production assistant had appeared from somewhere and was pressed against the wall with wide eyes. And Steven Spielberg, who had apparently come looking for Ford when he didn't come back from the restroom, was standing at the opposite end of the corridor taking in the scene with the analytical calm of a man who had directed enough action sequences to know exactly what had just happened. Spielberg walked down the hallway. He didn't rush. He moved with purpose. He reached Ford and looked at the cut under his eye. Ford waved him off. "I'm fine, Steven." Spielberg looked at Dale, looked at Eastwood, then looked back at Ford. "What do you need?" Spielberg asked. And that question carried weight, because Steven Spielberg asking "What do you need?" in 1984 was a man offering to deploy one of the most powerful networks in entertainment history. What do you need wasn't just about a bandage. It was about lawyers, publicists, studio executives, the machinery of destruction that could grind Dale Rushton into powder and scatter him across the San Fernando Valley. Ford shook his head. "I need a drink and a Band-Aid, in that order." Now here's where the story takes a turn that nobody expected. Eastwood walked away from Dale and approached Ford. This took guts. His bodyguard had just punched the man, and Eastwood was walking toward him with open hands, palms up, a gesture of surrender, a gesture of absolute contrition. And Clint Eastwood was not a man who apologized easily. The Dirty Harry persona wasn't entirely an act. Clint was tough. Clint was proud. Clint handled his business quietly and expected others to do the same. But right now, in this narrow corridor with broken glass on the floor and blood on Harrison Ford's face, Eastwood did something remarkable. He apologized. Fully. Without qualification. "Harrison, I'm sorry. That was inexcusable. It won't happen again. Whatever you need from me, you've got it." Ford looked at him for a long moment. His jaw was set. His left eye was already starting to swell. But his breathing had slowed. The combat mode was fading. And what replaced it was something more nuanced, something that the people who were watching didn't fully appreciate in the moment but would talk about for years afterward. Ford extended his hand. Eastwood took it. They shook, firm, brief, the kind of handshake that closes a negotiation, not the kind that opens one. And in that handshake was an understanding that bypassed lawyers and publicists and studio machinery entirely. This was two men of a certain generation, a certain code, settling something between themselves. "Dale's done," Eastwood said. It wasn't a question, it wasn't an offer, it was a statement. He was telling Ford, and telling Dale, and telling everyone in that hallway that this was Dale Rushton's last night as Clint Eastwood's bodyguard. Ford nodded. Dale said nothing. He was standing against the wall now, his hands still on his ribs, watching the two most powerful men in his orbit shake hands over his professional grave. And here's where I'll tell you something about Dale Rushton that complicates the story, that makes it harder to just write him off as a thug who got what he deserved. Dale's eyes were wet, not crying, not sobbing, but wet. His chin was trembling slightly, and he was looking at Eastwood with an expression that was pure devastation, not because he was losing a job, because he was losing Clint, the man who'd given him a chance, the man he'd built his entire identity around protecting. Dale's worst fear wasn't prison or lawsuits. His worst fear was being separated from the person who'd made him feel like he mattered. And he had caused that separation himself, with his own fists, in a hallway, over a shoulder brush that meant nothing. You couldn't help it. Even if you were furious at what Dale had done, even if you thought he deserved every consequence coming his way, that moment of recognition on his face was hard to watch. A man realizing in real time that his loyalty had become a weapon and he'd pointed it at the wrong target and blown up the only thing he cared about. Ford saw it too. And this is the thing that makes Harrison Ford more than just a movie star. He saw the devastation on Dale's face, and something in his expression softened, just slightly, just for a moment. The hard set of his jaw relaxed. He didn't say anything to Dale. No words of comfort. No, it's okay, buddy. But he gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible, an acknowledgement that he understood what this was costing the big man, even if it didn't change anything. Then Ford turned and walked down the hallway with Spielberg. He didn't look back. Listen to me carefully. What I've just described took maybe 4 minutes total, from the first shoulder brush to Ford walking away. 4 minutes. But in those 4 minutes, a bodyguard's career ended, a friendship was severed, and a story was born that would travel through Hollywood for decades, and the night wasn't over. Not even close. Because while Ford was getting his cut cleaned up in a green room, and Eastwood was dealing with Dale in a parking lot, the story was already loose, it was already mutating, and it was about to reach the ears of people who would use it for their own purposes in ways that none of the three men in that hallway could have predicted. Let me tell you what happened in the parking lot. Because that conversation between Eastwood and Dale is a piece of this story that almost nobody knows, and it changes everything about how you understand what happened next. Eastwood took Dale outside through a service exit. The parking lot behind the venue was half empty. The event was still going on inside. Music was playing. People were laughing. All of it felt absurd given what had just happened 30 feet from the cocktail bar. Clint leaned against a car. He didn't look at Dale at first. He looked at the sky. Clear night, stars visible, which in Burbank meant the smog had taken the evening off. Eastwood pulled a cigarette from somewhere. He didn't smoke regularly, but he kept a pack for moments when he needed something to do with his hands. "Tell me what you were thinking," Eastwood said. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't cold, he genuinely wanted to understand. Dale's voice was rough. "He put his hands on you, Clint. He bumped into me in a hallway. I bumped into him, too. That's what happens in hallways. It didn't look like that to me." Eastwood took a drag. Let the smoke out slowly. "What did it look like to you?" "It looked like he didn't respect you enough to watch where he was going." And there it was. Dale's core belief, stated plainly. Respect was physical, space was sacred, contact was violation. In Dale's world, you didn't touch the principle. You went around, you pressed yourself against the wall, you stopped walking, you did whatever it took to avoid contact. And if you didn't, you were saying something. You were saying this man doesn't matter enough for me to adjust my path. It was insane logic, but it was internally consistent, and it came from a place that was hard to argue with. because it came from Dale's own experience of being disrespected, of being treated as less than, of having people bump into him and shove past him and act like he wasn't there because he was just the help. Dale had taken all of that accumulated disrespect and projected it onto the one person he respected most, and he'd decided that nobody would ever treat Clint the way people had treated him. Eastwood understood this. You could see it in the way he listened, but understanding it didn't change the math. Dale, you hit Harrison Ford. I know. You hit Harrison Ford at an industry event with witnesses. I know, Clint. This isn't a bar in Bakersfield. This is my career. This is my reputation. You just created a problem that I'm going to be dealing with for months. Dale's massive shoulders dropped. His head lowered. The big man shrank, not physically. Physically, he was still enormous, but the energy around him collapsed inward. He became small in every way that mattered. What do you need me to do? Dale asked. Eastwood finished his cigarette, dropped it, stepped on it. Then he looked at Dale directly for the first time since they'd come outside. I need you to go home, Dale. I need you to not talk to anyone about this. No reporters, no friends, no family. I need you to disappear for a while. And I need you to understand that we're done. The word done hit Dale harder than Ford's punches had. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. He wanted to argue. He wanted to plead. You could see the words forming and dying before they reached his lips. Because even Dale, in his distorted, loyalty-warped mind, knew that Clint was right. There was no version of this where Dale kept his job. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Clint, Dale said, just the name, like saying it might change something. And here's the moment of vulnerability that catches everyone off guard. Eastwood pushed off the car. He walked up to Dale, and he put his hand on the big man's shoulder. The same gesture, but gentle. You were the best I ever had, Eastwood said. That's what makes this so hard. Then he walked back inside. Dale stood in the parking lot alone. The music from the event was muffled through the walls. The stars were out. The concrete was cold. And one of the most feared bodyguards in Hollywood stood there with tears on his face, holding his ribs where Harrison Ford had hit him, understanding with perfect clarity that his need to protect had become his destruction. But this story doesn't end in that parking lot. This story doesn't end with Dale driving home or Ford getting a bandage or Eastwood smoothing things over with studio executives. Because while all of that was happening, a young entertainment reporter named Jackie Brennan was inside the venue, and she had just heard a very interesting version of events from one of those caterers with the trays. And Jackie Brennan was hungry in the way that only a 26-year-old reporter at a third-tier entertainment outlet can be hungry. She didn't want to cover movie premieres and red carpet fashion for the rest of her life. She wanted a real story, a story with blood in it. She had just found one. Pay attention, because this is where the story expands beyond three men in a hallway. This is where it becomes about power and narrative, and who gets to control the story of what happened. And trust me, the battle over the narrative was going to be just as brutal as the fight itself. Brennan found the caterer. Young kid, maybe 22, working the event for minimum wage plus tips. He was shaking. He'd never seen anything like what he'd just witnessed. And when a pretty reporter with a notepad and a sympathetic expression asked him to tell her what happened, he talked. He talked a lot. And he got about 60% of it right, which in the game of telephone, that is entertainment journalism, was actually a pretty high accuracy rate. Brennan scribbled notes. She had Ford getting punched. She had the bodyguard. She had Eastwood present. She had blood. She had broken glass. She had everything she needed for a story that would make her career. But she was smart enough to know that she needed more. She needed a second source. Journalism 101. One witness is an anecdote. Two witnesses is a story. She found the production assistant, the kid who'd been pressed against the wall. He confirmed the broad strokes, added details. Ford fought back. Bodyguard went down. Eastwood pulled them apart. Brennan now had two sources and a story that was going to blow up. But here's where it gets complicated. Because Brennan also needed comment from the principals. That's how it works. You don't run a story about Harrison Ford getting punched without calling Harrison Ford's people. And you definitely don't run it without calling Clint Eastwood's people. So Brennan started making calls. From a payphone in the venue lobby, while the event was still going on, She called Ford's publicist. She called Eastwood's publicist. She called her editor. And the machinery of Hollywood damage control roared to life. Ford's publicist was a woman named Carol Manning, unflappable, experienced. She'd handled crises before. Her first call was to Ford himself, who was still in the green room with a butterfly bandage under his eye and a fresh bourbon in his hand. Their conversation was brief. "Harrison, a reporter has the story. What do you want to do?" Ford's answer was immediate. "Kill it. I can try, but she has witnesses. Then contain it. I'm not becoming a tabloid headline because some gorilla can't tell the difference between a hallway and a boxing ring." Manning went to work. She called Brennan back and delivered a masterclass in strategic vagueness. "There was a minor incident. It's been resolved privately. Mr. Ford has no comment and considers the matter closed." She used the word minor 4 times. She used the word resolved 3 times. She was building a wall of boring language designed to make the story seem not worth printing. And it might have worked, except for one thing. Eastwood's publicist handled it differently. His name was Ray Vincent, and Ray made a critical error. Instead of matching Manning's boring, nothing-to-see-here approach, Ray got aggressive. He called Brennan and told her that if she ran the story, Eastwood's legal team would look into the matter. He didn't say they'd sue. He didn't make an explicit threat. But the implication was clear. Run this story and there will be consequences. And if there's one thing you should never, ever do with a hungry 26-year-old reporter, it's threaten her. Brennan hung up the phone and smiled. Not because she was cruel, but because Ray Vincent had just confirmed the story in the most emphatic way possible. You don't threaten legal action over a minor incident that's been resolved. You threaten legal action over something real, something big, something that someone powerful wants to keep hidden. Ray Vincent had tried to build a wall. Instead, he'd built a billboard. Brennan called her editor back. "Run it," she said. "Run all of it." The story hit the next morning. Small outlet, limited circulation. But in 1984, a story didn't need to be in the Los Angeles Times to matter. It just needed to reach the right eyes. And by noon, the right eyes had read it. Variety picked it up, then the trades, then the entertainment segments on the evening news. And suddenly, the thing that Ford had wanted killed was very, very much alive. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. The story that Brennan published wasn't the story I've been telling you. She had the facts mostly right, but she framed it in a way that changed everything. Her headline wasn't about a bodyguard attacking Ford. Her headline was about Eastwood. Specifically, it implied that Eastwood had ordered the attack, that Dale Rushton was acting on Clint's instructions, that there was bad blood between Eastwood and Ford, and that the hallway incident was the culmination of a secret feud. None of this was true, not a word of it. But it made for a better story. Bodyguard punches actor is a police blotter item. Legendary actor sends enforcer after rival is a saga. And Brennan, for all her ambition, had made the classic reporter's mistake. She had let the story she wanted to tell overpower the story that actually happened. This is where you need to remember who we're dealing with. This wasn't some manufactured celebrity beef. This was Clint Eastwood and Harrison Ford, 2 men who had built their entire public personas on quiet competence and controlled masculinity. And now a 26-year-old reporter was telling the world that one of them had sent a 350-pound thug to assault the other. The phone started ringing, and they didn't stop for weeks. Ford's camp and Eastwood's camp, which had been operating independently in the hours after the incident, now had a common enemy, the false narrative. And this created one of the strangest alliances in Hollywood history. 2 rival stars, connected by a violent incident that should have made them enemies, were now forced to work together to kill a story that made them both look bad. Ford looked like a victim. Eastwood looked like a villain. Neither man wanted either role. Manning called Vincent. The same publicists who had been working at cross purposes 12 hours earlier were now on the same team. And they hatched a plan that was elegant in its simplicity. Ford and Eastwood would be seen together, in public, friendly, casual, undeniable, because the best way to kill a feud narrative isn't to deny it, it's to make it look ridiculous. 3 days after the Burbank incident, Ford and Eastwood showed up at the same restaurant in Beverly Hills. Not by accident, by design. They sat at a visible table near the window. They ate steaks. They drank wine. They talked and laughed for 2 hours. and the paparazzi, who had been tipped off by Manning with surgical precision, captured every moment. The photos ran everywhere. Ford and Eastwood, dining together, clearly comfortable in each other's company. Ford's black eye was visible but fading. Nobody mentioned it. The images spoke louder than any headline. These two men were fine. Whatever had happened, it was behind them. Brennan's story died. Not with a retraction, not with a correction. It just faded. The oxygen got sucked out of it by the sheer visual power of two icons sharing a meal. You can't maintain a feud narrative when the feuding parties are splitting a bottle of Cabernet and laughing about something. But here's what I want you to understand. The dinner solved the public problem. It did not solve the private one. Because behind the scenes, away from the cameras and the publicists and the damage control, there was still the matter of Dale Rushton, a man without a job, a man without a reference, a man whose name was now toxic in the security industry because word travels fast in that world, even faster than it travels in entertainment. Dale had punched a client's peer. That's not just a fireable offense. That's an industry blacklisting. Nobody was going to hire the bodyguard who assaulted Harrison Ford. Nobody. And Dale was spiraling. In the weeks after the incident, Dale went dark. He stopped answering his phone. He stopped showing up to the gym where he'd trained. His apartment in the valley became a cave, curtains drawn, TV on, bottles accumulating. The man who had been Clint Eastwood's shadow, who had walked through Hollywood like he owned the ground under his feet, was now sitting in a dark apartment, replaying the worst 4 minutes of his life on an endless loop. He replayed the shoulder brush. He replayed his hand shooting out. He replayed the look on Ford's face, confusion turning to anger, turning to that cold, calculating stare. He replayed the punch he'd thrown. He replayed getting driven backward and hitting the floor. He replayed the liver shot and the sound he'd made when his knees gave. And most of all, he replayed Eastwood's words in the parking lot. "You were the best I ever had. That's what makes this so hard." Those 12 words were destroying Dale Rushton more effectively than any punch Harrison Ford could have thrown. This is where most people think the story ends. The fight happened. The fallout was managed. The bodyguard disappeared into obscurity. Credits roll. But this story has a second act, and the second act is where it becomes something more than a Hollywood brawl story. The second act is about what happens when a violent man confronts the violence inside himself. And it starts with a phone call that Dale Rushton received 6 weeks after the incident, from the last person on earth he expected to hear from. His phone rang at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. He almost didn't answer. He'd been ignoring calls for weeks, but something made him pick up. Maybe he was tired of the silence. Maybe he was hoping it was Clint. It wasn't Clint. "Dale? This is Harrison Ford." Dale's hand tightened on the receiver. His mouth went dry. He said nothing for 5 seconds. Then, "How'd you get this number?" "I asked Clint for it." Which meant Clint had given it. Which meant Clint knew Ford was calling. Which meant something was happening that Dale didn't understand. "What do you want?" Dale asked. His voice was guarded, thick with weeks of isolation and self-recrimination. "I want to talk to you. In person. Can you meet me tomorrow?" Dale almost said no. Every instinct told him this was a trap. A setup. Ford was going to serve him with papers. Ford was going to have photographers there to capture the disgraced bodyguard. Ford was going to humiliate him. But then Dale thought about it for another second. Harrison Ford didn't need to trick him. Harrison Ford could have had him arrested that night, could have sued him into dust, could have destroyed him without ever picking up a phone. If Ford wanted to hurt Dale, he had 100 ways to do it that didn't involve a face-to-face meeting. So this was something else. And Dale was curious enough, or desperate enough, or broken enough to find out what. "Where?" Dale said. Ford gave him an address, a coffee shop in Sherman Oaks. Nothing fancy, the kind of place where nobody would recognize either of them. 10 a.m., Ford said. "Come alone." The line went dead, and Dale Rushton sat in his dark apartment holding a silent phone, wondering what Harrison Ford could possibly want from the man who had punched him in the face. That meeting in Sherman Oaks is where this story truly begins. Everything before it was prologue. Everything after it was consequence. And what happened in that coffee shop between a battered movie star and a disgraced bodyguard is the part of this story that nobody knows, that nobody has ever reported, and that I'm going to tell you right now. But first, I need you to do something for me. If you've made it this far, if you're as locked into this story as I think you are, hit that subscribe button, tap it right now. Because what comes next is the kind of story that doesn't come along very often, and I don't want you to miss part 2 when it drops. Seriously. One tap. I'll wait. Good. Let's keep going. Dale showed up 15 minutes early. He sat in a booth in the back corner, facing the door. Old habits. Security training never leaves you. He'd lost weight, maybe 15 pounds. His face was drawn. His eyes had that hollow look that comes from too many nights staring at the ceiling, replaying your worst moment. He ordered coffee and wrapped both hands around the mug and waited. Ford walked in at 10 on the dot. He was wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses and a plain jacket. The black eye was gone. The cut had healed to a thin line that would eventually become invisible. He spotted Dale immediately and walked to the booth without hesitation. No pause, no sizing up. He sat down across from Dale and took off his sunglasses and put them on the table and looked at the big man. Dale braced himself. For anger, for demands, for whatever this was. Ford ordered coffee, black. The waitress poured it and left. And then Ford did something that Dale would remember for the rest of his life. He leaned forward, wrapped both hands around his own mug in almost the exact same way Dale was holding his, and said, "Tell me about Clint. Not tell me why you hit me. Not tell me what's wrong with you. Not I'm going to sue you, or I want an apology, or you need to pay for what you did. Tell me about Clint." Dale blinked. His grip on the mug tightened. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "What do you mean?" he managed. "I mean, tell me what he means to you. Because I watched your face in that hallway, and what I saw wasn't a bodyguard doing his job. I saw something else, and I want to understand what it was. And this is where I need to stop part 1 and tell you something about what's coming." The conversation in that coffee shop lasted 3 hours. 3 hours. Harrison Ford sat in a booth in Sherman Oaks and listened to a man who had punched him in the face talk about loyalty and fear and the terrifying need to matter to someone. And by the end of those 3 hours, something had shifted between them. Not forgiveness exactly, something stranger, something harder to name. That conversation changed Dale Rushton's life. It changed the trajectory of his relationship with Eastwood. It changed how Ford thought about violence and vulnerability, and the strange alchemy that turns devotion into destruction. And it produced one moment, one single exchange, that everyone who has heard this story agrees is the most powerful thing either man ever said off camera. But that's part 2.